There truly is nothing like German football. From the dedicated fans vehemently protesting any attempt to corporatize their teams or their league, to their stadiums laden with beer and bratwurst that are home to fans of all ages, as football is often seen as an affordable family outing. One of the most interesting particularities of the Bundesliga nowadays is how many truly gigantic clubs are languishing in the lower tiers, with many of them experiencing hardships like this in recent times. The German obsession with keeping their football fan-owned is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it means that you effectively own a club that reflects your identity as a fan and not the whims of a billionaire or the investment opportunity of a hedge fund. On the other hand, it means that these clubs, maybe with the exception of Bayern, operate without a safety net. When a club like Chelsea underperforms so drastically that they don't even reach the European spots at the end of the season, Todd Bowley can coolly drop some hundreds of millions in the club's transfer budget, whereas one too many seasons like that for a German club will see it sell all of its best players to keep things running and sign players of lesser value, as footballers don't usually tend to sign for relegation-threatened sides out of the goodness of their heart. As German football has to re-evaluate its identity and goals, some new fallen giants have been replaced at the top of the table by clubs like RB Leipzig, joining fellow fallen brothers who have experienced their decline a long time ago. So, let's hop onto something like an all-wheel drive Audi and go for a nice drive on some unrestricted German motorways and visit some of Germany's biggest clubs who now play lower league football. We head to Hamburg for our first entry, where on the cold shores of the North Sea, Hamburger Sportverein are the only club outside of Bayern and Borussia Dortmund to have won the Champions League. Having picked up 3 German titles prior to the formation of the Bundesliga, the club spent the first decade of the newly established competition as just another German club playing in the top tier, counterbalancing top half finishes with lower half disappointments. By the early 70s, however, something was stirring in the north of Germany, as HSV appointed Peter Krohn as their new president, who revolutionized the club's finances, being only the 5th club in Germany to sign a shirt sponsor when they partnered up with Campari. This enabled the club to sign better and better players, leading them to win the 1976 DFB Pokal, which qualified them for next year's edition of the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup, which they also won. Their European triumph and their newfound wealth enabled them to sign Kevin Keegan in a shock move from Liverpool, who were probably the best team in Europe at the time. A move which was probably akin to someone like Real Sociedad signing Mo Salah today. With Keegan in the team picking up 2 Ballon d'Ors, the club won just 1 title and lost the 1980 European Cup final to Nottingham Forest after eliminating Real Madrid in the semis. Keegan's departure was made practically irrelevant by genius manager Ernst Happel joining the team. Under his guidance, Hamburg won the 1983 European Cup against Juventus, 2 Bundesliga titles and 1 DFB Pokal. Although they did not manage to replicate those heights in more recent seasons, up until 2018, Hamburg were the only German club to have played every season of the Bundesliga since 1963. However, during the 2010s, the club experienced a sharp downturn, mainly due to the absence of European football, as well as an average of 2 managers per season. The managerial upheaval meant that the squad lacked clarity in its signings, and it meant that players like Hakan Çalhanoğlu and Heung-min Son ended up being replaced by a discordant mess of average signings left over from the various managers that came and went. Thus, the club of Keegan have been languishing in the 2nd tier since 2018, somehow failing to make the promotion places each year, and are currently in danger of seeing their bitter rivals St. Pauli make the Bundesliga before them. Before we head south to the Ruhr industrial area to visit Gelsenkirchen, make sure to check out my video on Keegan's move to Hamburg if you want to find out more about their glory days. Schalke are not only Germany's 3rd most successful club by number of trophies won, but also the 4th biggest club in the world by number of members, with a staggering 178,000. Schalke's true heyday came during the 1930s and 40s, as they were at the forefront of professionalization in German football. They picked up 6 titles during those years, and some argue that were it not for Germany being nearly completely destroyed in the Second World War, Schalke would have continued to dominate the league in the 50s and 60s. Instead, a solitary title in the post-war era in 1958 was all they had to show for until the 90s, when the club embarked on another rise. The team that was nicknamed the Eurofighters won the 1997 edition of the UEFA Cup against Inter Milan under head coach Huub Stevens, whose motto was Die Null muss stehen, or the zero must stand, referring to their playstyle that emphasized that there would be a 0 next to the club's name on the scoreboard at the end of games. Schalke entered the new millennium on the rise and were mainstays in the top 4 during the early 2000s, as well as back-to-back DFB Pokal winners in 2001 and 2002. Their newfound success was shrewdly exploited on the financial and sponsorship side of things, culminating in a mega sponsorship deal with Gazprom being signed in 2006, with the Russian gas giant being expected to provide an investment worth more than 100 million euros in the coming seasons. With their newfound wealth, Schalke signed attacking duo Klaas-Jan Huntelaar and Raúl, and under Ralf Rangnick's tutelage, the club would eliminate Inter from a European competition once again, reaching the Champions League semi-finals in 2011, where they lost to Manchester United. If that semi-final can be viewed as the summit of Schalke's rise, Manuel Neuer's sale to Bayern München at the end of that season can be viewed as the first step downwards towards their descent into the second tier. Financial mismanagement, failed big money signings like Kevin Prince Boateng, and the sales of talented academy graduates like Leroy Sané and Leon Goretzka came to a head at the start of the COVID pandemic. In 2021, Schalke were relegated to the Zweite Bundesliga for the first time since the 90s and bounced back just in time to see their main sponsor banned due to some Russian garden gnome deciding that the people of Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to have nice things. Schalke therefore are currently 14th in the second tier, with a further relegation being a very real possibility. From Gelsenkirchen, we head south to a club whose downfall I have covered in a previous video on my channel, Kaiserslautern. In 2014, 6 of Germany's players that started the World Cup final were Bayern players, with Toni Kroos joining Real Madrid just a few days after the final. Exactly 6 years prior to that, Germany also stood in a World Cup final, although the mood around that team was very different. Germany was making their first World Cup appearance after the Second World War, having not played in 1950, and were viewed not only as unfancied outsiders and semi-professionals, but as outright hatred, as the horrors of the war were still very much fresh in the memories of Europeans. In front of them stood one of the greatest national team sides of all time, the mighty Magyars, who had beaten them earlier in the tournament and were full professionals who hadn't lost a game in the past 5 years. The German manager Sepp Herberger had built his squad around a core of Kaiserslautern players, with 5 of them being on the pitch that day, and brothers Fritz and Ottmar Walter being the superstar attacking duo of the squad. Herberger lived around 60 kilometers from Kaiserslautern and was very familiar with the squad and especially with the Walter brothers, who had rebuilt their club from the ground up after the war. That first World Cup win was credited by many historians with not only kickstarting the footballing machine that Germany later became, but also with helping Germany as a country regain its international recognition. During those times, the so-called Walter 11 of Kaiserslautern was viewed as one of the best and most exciting teams in Germany, but they failed to replicate their success in the newly established Bundesliga. After some decades of anonymity, Kaiserslautern rose during the 90s, winning 2 titles and 2 DFB Pokals. The second title was all the more impressive, as the team had just been promoted after a shock relegation to the second Bundesliga. Coach Otto Rehhagel, who would shock the world in 2004, leading Greece to victory in the Euros, was key to their success. However, financial mismanagement and poor signings, coupled with a failure to reach the Champions League spots, meant that Kaiserslautern embarked on a downward trajectory that would see them taste relegation in the mid-2000s and in 2012. In 2018, they went one step lower, getting relegated to the 3rd Bundesliga and being nearly unable to pay for their license to play there. Nowadays, the club who arguably kick-started German football as we know it today is struggling to maintain its second-tier status. Before we visit one of the prettiest German cities who host a very famous Christmas market, I think some honorable mentions whose downfalls aren't as drastic are in order. Borussia Mönchengladbach absolutely dominated the 70s, winning 5 titles, 2 UEFA Cups and reaching the European Cup final where they lost to Liverpool, nowadays are just another Bundesliga team. Werder Bremen, who are 4-time German champions, as well as UEFA Cup and UEFA Cup winners have been relegated this decade. VfB Stuttgart, who have 1 Bundesliga title more than Werder, but lost the 2 previously mentioned European trophies, have been relegated twice since 2017. And finally 1860 München, who were until the 60s the premier team from Bavaria and a Bundesliga founding member, were relegated to the regional 4th tier of German football in 2018. Their owner Hassan Ismaik, who bought a 60% stake in the club in 2011 with the aims of, in his words, preserve the tradition of the club, refused to pay for the club's playing license after they were relegated to the third tier. He still remains in charge despite the club experiencing nothing but misery under his leadership, possibly serving as a cautionary tale against foreign investment in German football. Oh god, I forgot about the East German clubs. Okay, so two more honorable mentions, as the Stasi officer assigned to me has just texted me that they will be most displeased if I fail to mention any East German clubs. And speaking of the dreaded secret police of East Germany, they had a hand in the tale of the two dynamos, which dominated the DDR Oberliga. Dynamo Dresden, who were actually former two-time German champion Dresdner Sportklub with communist clothing, was one of the biggest clubs in the Soviet-occupied zone. After winning one East German title in 1954, their whole squad and place in the Oberliga was transferred to BFC Dynamo Berlin, as the state wanted to have a competitive team in East Berlin, as the local population kept supporting Western clubs like Hertha. Between the two of them, they won 8 and 10 league titles, with Dynamo Berlin's 10 league titles coming back to back. Okay, the Stasi officer has just told me I can get back to my list and has asked you all to let me know in the comments if you would like to see a deep dive on the story of these two clubs. With these little detours out of the way, we finally head to Nuremberg, where you only have to look at the FC Nuremberg's nicknames to understand what this club is about. Amongst them, you can find names like The Legend, The Glorious, and The Old Champion, and the one most used, which is The Club, alluding to the fact that for a very long time, they truly were the club and no others could come near them. After their establishment in 1900, they quickly came to dominate the regional competitions they played in. From 1920 to 1927, Nuremberg only missed out on the title 3 times. The German championship was decided by a playoff of the best regional teams, and Nuremberg won those first 5 titles without conceding a single goal in any of the finals. During that time, the club went 4 years and 104 games without losing once. Following their period of dominance, they picked up 3 more titles and 3 DFB Pokals, and they entered the first season of the new Bundesliga as the most decorated German club. On the European stage, they reached the quarterfinals of the European Cup in 1962, losing to eventual winners Benfica, and 1 year later, they lost the semi-final of the Cup Winners' Cup to Atletico Madrid. During those years, the team was spearheaded by Max Morlock, one of the best strikers Germany ever produced. He was a one-club man who scored 294 goals in 472 appearances for Nuremberg, as well as the first German goal of the 1954 World Cup final, which started their comeback. After joining the Bundesliga and spending some years in mid-table, the club won their first title in 1968 with a dominating display. However, they would be relegated the next season as coach Max Merkel decided to release 10 of the players from his title-winning squad, believing them to be too old in order to make room for younger signings, which were supposed to make them more competitive for the upcoming edition of the European Cup. Instead, this move saw them exit the European Cup at the first round and get relegated, which destroyed the club's finances and saw them spend 9 years in the second tier. From there, the club embarked on a journey of mediocrity, which saw them face financial issues and get relegated several times leading up to the 2000s. During that time, they were still record German champions, an honor they lost to hated rivals Bayern München at the end of the 1987 season. A hatred I nearly experienced firsthand when, as a kid, my uncle and cousin took me to a Nuremberg game and my uncle tried to trick me into wearing a Bayern cap before my aunt told him to stop the nonsense. After spending a season in the third tier during the late 90s and 2 more relegations, Nuremberg seemed to find their feet again, winning the 2007 DFB Pokal, which seemed to herald a comeback for the old champions. It was a false dawn, however, as bad signings tanked any chance of continuing that success, and they were soon relegated the next season. Since their last trophy win in 2007, the club has spent 9 of the past 16 seasons in the second tier. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end. Let me know in the comments what topics you would like me to cover in the future, and make sure to like and subscribe as I have another video on fallen giants from the rest of Europe coming soon.